of a millimetre. So the manufacture of these is quite complex, and so is the technology within it. There are two examples here of different types of fuel cell, and on the right is the one that I would like to talk about a little further. But to do that, I need to just explain very briefly that the development of these technologies requires research which addresses problems at a wide range of length scales. In the bottom right of the picture, you will see that there is research which involves the modification of the atomic structure of the materials that are used in order to get the right performance and actually design materials for a particular purpose. Moving to the left, there is a need to develop the structure of the material at the micrometric length scale. And then moving up, there is a need to design the overall mechanical structure at the scale of millimetres. And then, of course, there is the system aspect that needs to be considered. And I would like to give you an example of the one on the bottom left, which is the design of the electrodes. This picture on the right shows, in white, the electrolyte, the solid part of a fuel cell, and the grey blobs are the porous electrode that is connected to it. And the critical thing to look at here is what is called the three-phase boundary. That is the junction between the electrode and the electrolyte. This is critical to the performance of these fuel cells because at that point you need to persuade oxygen gas to come to a junction between the electrolyte and the electrode. And it must come to the junction because at that point you catalyse the dissociation of the oxygen into an oxygen ion and electrons. It must be at the junction because the electrons must be able to easily move away through the electrode, and the oxygen ions must be able to easily move away through the electrolyte. So the design and optimization of these micrometric interfaces is critical to the performance. That's a description of what actually happens, and if everything works properly, I would like to show you how work is currently being done to improve this. On the left is a scanning electron microscope image of the interface between electrolyte and electrode. On the right is a complete three-dimensional computer representation of that interface, and that has been created by taking the scanning electron microscope image on the left. It's actually a SIMS image, but we won't go into the detail of that. Taking a very thin slice off that, taking the image of the next layer down, and proceeding slice by slice to build up a complete three-dimensional representation of that complex interface between the electrolyte and the electrode. Having done that, it is possible to use a computer simulation of those electrochemical processes I just described, assess their performance, and then redesign that 3D model of the complete interface to seek ways of improving the performance. Having done that redesign, it is then possible to go back and to modify the process parameters that produce that so as to get an optimum performance of the material. This is very complex work that is at the boundaries of what we are currently capable of doing technologically. And it is one way in which we can try to produce better materials. But equally, we have to produce the overall structures. And I spoke earlier about the need to design the structures. In this particular fuel cell, the way that the fuel cell is constructed is a very thin stainless steel plate is used as a support, and the electrochemically active elements, the electrode, the electrolyte, the electrode, are placed down onto that sheet using a system very similar to printing. it produces a fuel cell that is just a few microns thick. The problem is you need to get the fuel through the metal plate in order for the fuel cell to work, and therefore you need to make the metal plate porous. You also need to do some processing of the fuel, and this diagram shows that you can get the fuel from a variety of sources. But I'd like to concentrate on how you actually make the metal plate porous. And I have here a diagram that shows a production technique that has recently been developed, and it shows the production of a single plate that can then be used as the structure for a fuel cell being manufactured in real time. And you will see from the operator's hands the scale of the plate. What you've seen there is a multiple laser manufacturing process. That line of fire that you saw going across the plate was the lasers drilling holes in the plate. Each hole is less than a micron in diameter. They're on a pitch of just a few microns, and they're placed with an accuracy of better than 1%. So there are several 100,000 holes have just been drilled in that plate while you were watching the film. This is a manufacturing technique that, again, is at the limits of what we can currently do with technology. And this is an example of how, in order to use fossil fuels more efficiently and better, we are combining production technology with the materials technology I spoke about before, with materials processing technology and engineering design to produce the effect that we want. But we're still talking there about fossil fuels, and I would now like to turn towards the use of renewable fuels, because renewable fuels, I believe, we're going to go back to, hence the word cycle in the title of this talk. The Earth receives a lot of energy from the sun every year. It's regular, it's constant, it's reliable. To show how much energy we receive, if this cube represents the total energy that hits the Earth from the sun each year, about this much goes into the energy of the wind driven by thermal convection, and that small red block that you can just see is the total amount of energy used by mankind for all purposes in a year. That's all fossil energy and all other forms of energy. What you can see from that is that the Earth is not short of energy. We use only a tiny fraction of what comes from the sun. But the problem with the sun is that it's very difficult to collect the energy because it is very diffuse. So one solution, that is the technological route, is effectively to try and build your own sun that you can keep in a power station. And this is the inspiration behind the international program to develop a nuclear fusion reactor to reproduce the processes in the sun. In the center of that reactor, you will see that there is a void, which is where a plasma exists, and it is surrounded by a brown material, which is lithium. During the operation of the reactor, neutrons emitted from the plasma strike the lithium and generate tritium, which is an isotope of hydrogen. Tritium is the basic fuel that is used by the reactor. And to explain what is needed in this, I'm using a laptop computer here to give you this presentation. It's got a battery. If I were to take the battery from two laptop computers, take the lithium out of the battery, and if I were to add some water to that, and this is a very crude representation of what happens in the, inside the reactor, and how much water? The equivalent of about one bathtub of water, then that would produce in a fusion reactor enough energy to meet your individual energy needs for a complete lifetime. Not a year, a lifetime. 75 years. Potentially, therefore, the output of this is extremely large, and it's potentially an extremely attractive approach. However, when I was a student, as an undergraduate, I was taught about fusion reactors, and I was told that it would be 50 years before they were commercially available. A few months ago, I spoke to the person who is in charge of the big international demonstration, and I asked him, how long do you believe it will be before these reactors are available? And his answer was 43 years and 6 months. So we seem to have advanced about 6 years in about 40 years. The problem, therefore, with this approach is that it carries a high technological challenge and a high technological risk. It may work, and I hope it does do, but we have many barriers to overcome. So the next thing we need to look at is, if it doesn't work, can we use all that energy from the sun? Well, I would like to not talk about solar photovoltaics. I'd like to look at this at a high-level engineering approximation of the problem. Today, people in the world consume about 20% of the world's plant life as food. There are well over 6 billion people living on the earth today, and those people, us, we represent about 1% of the total biomass in the world. The rest of it is plants, animals, insects, and other aspects. So how much energy do we need to survive? Well, you may know that the average human need is about 2,000 kilocalories of energy per day as food intake. And if you convert that into joules and divide it by 24 hours per day, the answer is that each of us is a 100-watt machine, a biological machine requiring 100 watts of energy. So if we know what our energy requirements are, can we see what the limit is of what we can survive using the energy available to us? Well, yes, we can. Because on average, on the world, the land receives about 4 kilowatt hours of solar energy on every square metre every day. If all that energy was captured by plants, and plants are less than 1% efficient at converting the solar energy to energy that we can use as food, then equivalently, each square metre of land produces about 0.04 kilowatt hours every day of productive plant output. Now remember, we are 100-watt machines, so we need 2.4 kilowatt hours per day. And that is equivalent to about 60 square metres of land in order to capture the energy that we need to stay alive. So we can look at the energy balance. If we look at the amount of land available to us, agriculture occupies about half the available land. And the key figures are that the world has 149 million square metres of land, and of that, about 17.5 million square metres, 13%, is suitable for arable land, land for growing crops. Now, if we assume each person needs 60 to 150 square metres of land to stay alive, that's to capture the energy, what we can see is that the world, in energy terms, can theoretically support 100 billion people. But those 100 billion people would all need to be vegetarian, and they'd all need to be people who lived on allotments and never travelled anywhere, because they're using all the energy to stay alive. Now, of course, this is not an accurate estimate of what the world can support, because there are many other aspects. Water is a much more important level. And the purpose of doing this sum is to say to you again, we're not short of energy, we're short of means of capturing the energy around us. As an example of a city, it is estimated that New York City, Manhattan Island is at the centre of that photograph, requires about 300 times the amount of plant-derived resources their regions can produce. That's controlled by a number of factors. If we look at energy, and I've by comparison taken the example of Greater London, which has a population of a little over 8 million, if we look at the land area, and we look at the total energy consumption of the people that live there, that's all forms of energy for all purposes. Each of the people in London uses about 55 kilowatt hours of energy per day. And yet, the incident solar energy on the area of land that they occupy is more than 10 times that, 585 kilowatt hours per person per day. Again, we're not short of energy, but we are short of ways of exploiting it. The classic way in which we are currently exploiting renewable energy is to tap into the wind, that small proportion of the solar energy. And wind turbines are now a very well-established technology. But if we look at the UK, we're not doing very much about it. The UK has about 2,000 megawatts capacity of wind turbines installed. It generates just 1% of the UK's electricity. 1%. We have an objective in Europe to ensure that 20% of all our energy comes from renewable sources by the year 2020. So if the UK were to say we'd like 20% of our energy to come from wind, we would need, on top of what we have now, another 28,000 megawatts of wind turbine capacity. But in fact, to meet these targets, it's likely that we will need to generate much more electricity from renewable energy than that average figure, because it is easier to do for electricity than it is for transport and for other industrial purposes. So our best estimate is we'll probably need more than double that, about 60,000 megawatts of wind turbine capacity, if we do it with wind. 60,000 megawatts compares with the total wind energy systems installed in the world today of 74,000 megawatts. In other words, in 12 years, if the UK were to reach this target, it would need to install well over 3/4 of what the world has managed to do in 30 years. To do that, it would need to absorb 80% of the world's total manufacturing capacity of wind turbines, starting today for the next 12 years. Now, I do not wish to say that this is not possible. What I'm trying to do is to illustrate that tapping the renewable energy is an enormous engineering and industrial challenge. And if we were to put in that much capacity, it would mean more than 10,000 additional wind turbines scattered across the UK. And because of the nature of the UK, in its society, it has very active groups who are concerned about the environment. It's quite a challenge to get people to agree to have these things installed anywhere where they can see them. So this is a big political issue. There is another factor. If you go back into the historical records from 300 years ago in the UK, when wind energy was the primary means of grinding corn to produce flour, and flour itself was a widely traded commodity, the records show that there were regular shortages of flour in towns because there had been extended periods of still weather. There was no energy to produce the flour. And one of the issues with wind is that it is not a reliable resource. It does not necessarily arrive every day like the sun. The UK itself is fortunate in that it has a very large seacoast, as many other parts of the land do, and there is a lot of potential for taking energy from the sea. This is basically wave energy, which is just another form of wind energy, or tidal energy. And what you see there is a photograph of an experimental tidal energy turbine. And of course, there are well-known barrages to also exploit tidal resource. The question is, How much tidal resource is there? Well, I was asked the question whether, if we started to exploit this, we would in some way destroy it. And with the help of some colleagues, I found that there is evidence arising from studies of sedimentary deposits in South Africa, together with astronomical calculations, from which it is possible to estimate the pattern of tidal cycles from 3,000 million years ago. Now, clearly there is a lot of uncertainty in this, but the indications are that then the lunar month was about 20 days. In other words, shorter than today, and therefore the Earth-Moon distance was smaller. What we can deduce from this is that friction is actually slowing the rate at which the Moon goes round the Earth, but it's not happening very quickly. So we can actually try and exploit the tidal energy that's available if we wish. And I'd like to now start to close off this talk by talking about the most successful renewable energy system that we know in the world, which is plants. Plants represent the majority of biomass on the Earth, and they are totally solar powered, and they don't even need to move around or do anything much to capture the energy. How do they work? Well, it's photosynthesis. You all know that. Photosynthesis involves combining carbon dioxide gas together with liquid water, together with the energy contained in photons of light, to produce carbohydrate precursors that the plant can then use as an energy source. That process has got two steps, what's called the light reaction and the dark reaction. In the first, the photons are captured and the plant actually uses them to create a gradient of protons. That is, it takes hydrogen atoms and it takes electrons out of the hydrogen atoms and produces positively charged hydrogen. That positively charged hydrogen is then used to power the production of high energy molecules, which themselves capture the carbon dioxide and make the carbohydrate precursors on which plants live. Now, one example of this is green algae, the very small material that you may have come into contact with. Algae is very interesting as a material because it is, again, wholly solar powered. However, one characteristic that it has that could be of use to us in the future is if it is living in a fairly low temperature of around 4 degrees Celsius, the internal processes do not operate quickly enough to use all the light energy that will fall on it from a clear sky. And it converts its behaviour such that it uses the excess energy that is arriving at it to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, and it emits these as free gases. The valuable lesson that we may be learning from that is that finding a way of generating hydrogen is one of the key drivers of renewable energy approaches, because hydrogen is potentially a very clean way of transporting energy around. And we have here a small organism that does that simply as a way of protecting itself when it's in a situation of being hit with too much solar energy. But they're small things, and I'd like to talk now about something that is surprisingly important, a material called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. You may have heard of this. If you haven't, you may be surprised to know that this material is found in all living organisms, plants, insects, animals, people. And you as individuals in your bodies manufacture every day approximately 100 kilograms of ATP. You manufacture it from adenosine diphosphate, or ADP, and the difference between these is simply a phosphate ion that is attached to the molecule. This mechanism is the way that all living things move the energy around to support what I spoke about earlier, the dark reaction. As engineers and scientists, this therefore is the way that everything has decided is the best way of converting solar energy. So we need to be interested in it. How does it do this? Well, each one of us and each plant and each insect contains the same protein. And here is a computer image of the protein that makes ATP. It doesn't look very promising. But for those of us that are engineers, if we look at its function, which increasingly with modern instrumentation we're able to develop, it starts to look surprisingly simple. Because the picture of it shows that what it actually is a proton-powered motor. And when I say motor, it actually moves. Protons are used at the bottom of that picture on the right as a means of causing motion, just like an electric motor does, and that distorts the structure of the protein at the top in such a way that it provides the mechanism by which ADP can be transferred into ATP. Now, here's a very simple picture of it, but the top of the protein has got receptors. The receptors can accept ADP, that is the bottom image in the diagram there, and if you move to the right, it takes the phosphate, and within that receptor it is bound to the ADP to produce ATP, and that is then used by the body. Somewhere in the body, the reverse happens, the ATP is converted back to ADP and releases energy, because you need to put energy in to make ATP from ADP. And this is the energy carrier that organisms use. And so I've got a picture here, which hopefully will move, which shows this actually happening. The little dots that you can see are protons in the body. The bottom picture is the electric motor, and the top picture is where the ATP is manufactured. So if we look at this, you'll see that the protons move into receptors at the bottom. They interact and power a motion which causes the top of this protein to distort in such a way that it becomes a receptor and a processor for the ADP and the ATP. And this is taken in, converted and ejected. And if we look at the top, you can see a representation of what happens. There's the ADP and a phosphate. They come together, they bind inside the receptor, and then as the motor turns, they are released by the receptor. This is an electromechanical system embodied in a piece of biological mechanism. The value potentially of this is if we can understand some of these mechanisms and start to find ways of improving on them so that they are more efficient, we potentially have a way in which we can take existing plant life and start to improve the efficiency with which it generates the protons and uses them to create these energetic forms. This is one possible example of how we might move towards a way of capturing this abundant solar energy that we will need in the future. So I'm going to close my talk there, and I'd just like to summarise that, first of all, there is a big political imperative to reduce carbon emissions. If that political imperative is followed through, if we do not find a way of replacing the abundant energy that we currently use, there will be a substantial impact on modern life. This hall is only possible with electricity. The air conditioning depends upon electricity. We